Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. I really wanted to do this murder first because it's so creepy. This is the unexplained murder of room 1046. On January 2nd of 1935, a man who was going by the name of Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. While staying in the hotel, there were multiple accounts of housekeeping finding him in the room, sitting upright on the bed, fully awake, fully dressed, and sitting in almost complete darkness alone. There was also a confirmed account of a maid coming into the room when he was not there and finding a note by the bed that read, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes, wait." There were actually several accounts of housekeeping hearing a couple of voices in the room, particularly the voice of a man who was not checked in and who was not this person. On January 4th, a bellhop enters the room, which had been locked from the outside, and finds Roland on the floor covered in blood. He had been beaten and stabbed, but was still alive. Police were called to the scene and questioned him while he was still alive and asked him who had done this to him, and he said no one. He had just hit his head on the tub. Roland would die in the hospital several hours later without confirming any suspects. As police are looking for leads, they realized the name that he had given to the hotel was not his name. Police ended up running his sketch in the papers, but nobody was able to come forward to adequately identify him at the time. After about a year and a half from the murder, a woman comes forward from Alabama named Ruby Ogletree, who was able to identify this as her son, Artemis, who had been hitchhiking to California and left home at the age of 17. Unfortunately, till this day, there are still large parts of this case that are wide open and may never be solved, but that is the murder of room 1046. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is a case that is bone-chilling to me, and I remember the first time that I heard it too. This is the unsolved mystery of the Lady of the Dunes. On July 26th of 1974, a 12-year-old girl stumbles upon a woman laying face down on a beach blanket in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts. As she gets a bit closer, she realizes what she's looking at is the body of a corpse. This woman had been laying there in the dunes for up to 3 weeks. She was found almost decapitated, her hands cut off, and a severe head wound that likely came from somebody who was laying there next to her in the sand. She was also found with a blue bandana and a pair of blue jeans that were under her head at the time that she died. And despite this massive public search effort to try to identify her, no one is ever able to come forward to accurately identify the Lady of the Dunes. The body has been exhumed multiple times, trying to scrap her new evidence, make more modern composites of her face, but despite all of that, the case still remains cold. One of the more recent theories is actually a connection to the 70s film Jaws, which had been filming that exact summer just about 100 miles away from Provincetown. In the film, an extra can be spotted who is wearing the exact same clothing that was found with the Lady of the Dunes. And side by side, she's also a very close match to the modern composite drawing. Despite a ton of public outreach, no one has ever come forward to either claim themselves to be or identify this extra. The case remains unsolved and the question still remains, who was the Lady of the Dunes? Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is just an eerie case. This is the mysterious murder of Blair Adams. Adams was a construction worker living in British Columbia, and a few weeks prior to the events that took place, his friends and family noticed a very stark change in his personality. On July 5th, 1996, he withdraws all of his money from his accounts and leaves for the US unexpectedly. Eventually, he makes his way to Knoxville, Tennessee in this rental car. The rental car marks one of the first known sightings of Adams once he reaches the US at a gas station. While at the gas station, Adams asks an attendant to help him start his car. The attendant realizes he's using the wrong key and offers to help look. He asks him to check his pockets, which he refuses to do. He instead decides to leave the car at the gas station and just go to a nearby hotel. At around 5:30 p.m., Adams arrives at the Fairfield Inn, where he's seen outside pacing anxiously for almost an hour before he goes inside, gets a room, doesn't take his change, and doesn't go to the room, just leaves. This would also mark the last time Adams was ever seen alive. The following morning, the body of Blair Adams is discovered near a local construction site where he's covered in bruises, scratches, has a severe wound on his head, and a fatal wound to his abdomen. The strange part about this case is that all of Adams' belongings were found with his body. All of his cash, his jewels, the missing key to that car, and there was also a long strand of hair that was found in his hand, presumably ripped out from his attacker. Till this day, no one really knows why Adams traveled to Tennessee alone or who's behind the murder. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is a case that does not sit right with me. Today we are covering the unsolved death of Matrice Richardson. On September 16th, 2009, 24-year-old Matrice is arrested in Malibu in a very manic state. Her family is contacted and they beg officers to keep her in custody while she's in a state of distress so she's not a danger to herself, which they do not. Around 12:30 in the morning, she is completely released from custody. She is released without any of her belongings and she is completely alone. The last verified sighting would be around 6:30 a.m. that same morning when she's spotted up a hike spanning several miles into Montanito and she's seen in someone's backyard. The police are contacted for the trespassing, but she's gone before anybody even gets there, making this the last moment that she was seen alive. Follow for part 2. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is part 2 of the Matrice Richardson case. So after she's spotted in the backyard at 6:30 in the morning, she would never be seen alive again. Matrice goes missing for over 10 months, but she would eventually be found by rangers who spot her in a wooded creek area over 7 miles away from the sheriff's station. Her body is described as completely undressed, partially preserved, and her head is completely severed. Police officers are the first officials to arrive at the scene before anyone else. This is when the case gets unsettling. Police wait over 90 minutes before contacting the coroner to come to the scene. They then delay the coroner from coming for hours. There were also conflicting reports about the state in which the body was found, the location of the severed head, whether or not it was severed. In that time before the coroner gets there, the body is moved, the scene is disrupted, and the remains are completely collected before the coroner even has a chance to inspect the scene, and it's ruled an accidental death. The coroner even goes on to make a statement saying he had never seen a case in which remains were removed without the presence of a coroner. There's also new evidence that comes to light when security footage crops up from the night she was in custody in her cell, which her family was told did not exist. It does show Matrice in her cell in severe distress, but the mystery of her death remains unexplained. Over the years, various investigators have weighed in on the case, and due to the nature of the remains and the handling of the scene, it's not off the table that foul play and/or a cover-up might have been involved. So this is where there's a little bit of a discrepancy with the reporting. The first officer on the scene is the first one to report that the head is severed and allegedly took a picture of the crime scene which proves that. The police department would later retract that statement and say that as that officer was moving the body, he accidentally pulled from the head and removed it himself. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering the disappearance of Maura Murray. Maura is a 21-year-old college student studying nursing in Massachusetts in the year 2004. On February 9th, she sends an email to school letting them know she'll be gone for a week due to a family death, but no one in her family had died. Records that were obtained from her computer would show an earlier search on MapQuest for directions to Burlington, Vermont. At 3:40 p.m. on the same day, she would withdraw all of her money from a local ATM. At around 4 or 5 p.m., she takes off on this trip, having told no one, and just starts traveling up Interstate 91 North. Around 7:27 p.m., Maura's car is crashed on a sharp snowy turn along Route 112 in New Hampshire, and a neighbor would call the police. Another driver who's returning home also passes her and offers to call for help. She pleads with him not to and insists that she's already called AAA, but phone records would later show that she never called AAA that night. The man carries on home but decides to call 911 anyway. Between 7:27 and the police arriving at 7:46, Maura is gone. The car is found completely abandoned and she's taken her cell phone and her credit cards, none of which have ever shown a record of being used since that night. That driver would be the last verified sighting of Maura. A witness would later come forward to report seeing a young person dressed in dark clothing traveling very quickly by foot around 8:30 p.m., roughly 4 to 5 miles up Route 112 on the same night. But it was never confirmed if this was Maura. It's been over 17 years since the disappearance, and the case has never been solved. This story is terrifying to me. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. On August 8th, 2013, Brandon Lawson gets into a fight with his girlfriend. She believes he's under the influence, and he leaves at 11:54 p.m. to go to his dad's place. While driving after midnight, Brandon runs out of gas along Route 277 near Bronte, Texas, and he calls his brother for help. He speaks distressingly, claiming that he sees someone on the highway and that he's being followed, but it's unclear whether he might have been hallucinating or if he actually saw someone. Between 12:50 and 1:15 in the morning, Brandon would make a series of very distressing phone calls, one of which is to 911. For reasons unknown, he would leave his truck and then sprint into the woods off the highway. Officers and his brother arrive by 1:10 and find the truck completely abandoned. His brother then gets a call from Brandon where he's described as panicked and claims that he's bleeding. His brother asks where he is and he replies, "I can see you, I'm right here." But neither police nor his brother can see or hear him anywhere. This is the last known call received from Brandon before he's deemed a missing person. The car is towed by morning and he has never been seen since. But the question still haunts the family. Did Brandon really see someone on the highway that night? And if he did, where did he go? Do not watch this video if you are easily scared. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering a story, I think it was reported in 2019, about the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The couple that reported the story wished to remain anonymous, so of course I am going to be respectful of that. The story does take place in the Rocky Mountains, which is a really popular location for sightseeing, for hiking. I've driven through there a couple of times. At some point on their hike, they're going way off the trail. They're just basically trekking through the woods. They're not even on a real path anymore. They stumble upon what they describe to be kind of like a small silo. It's basically just a tiny structure that has a door, but nothing else around it. This is pretty brave, but they decide to go explore and open the door. What they find inside is so eerie. They describe it as what sounds like a torture cell. They describe a single chair, they say there are chains in the corner, and they also report seeing a trap door in the floor which they knew they were not going to open. While they're there, they also report possibly hearing footsteps outside of this thing, so they immediately close the door and they head down on the hike as fast as they can. They get back to their car and they just head home. They're freaked out. It's never really clear whether or not they reported this to the police, which is maybe in part why they chose to remain anonymous, but they're still never clear what it is they walked in on. So what do you think this mysterious room is? I don't find this case to be a mystery. I see this more as a cover-up. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the mysterious case of Tamala Horsford. November 3rd, 2018. Tamala arrives to an adult slumber party with a group of women from the local football league, some of which she did not know very well. There were also 3 men at the party, either boyfriends or a husband, and some would even spend the night. The last reported sighting was around 2 in the morning when she's seen in the kitchen just before leaving to go have a cigarette on the porch while everyone else was asleep. The backdoor security system registered the door opening, closing, and then opening again at around 1:57 a.m., and that was it. The following morning, Tamala is discovered face down at the bottom of the balcony just off the porch. By 8:59 a.m., Jose Barrera, the homeowner's boyfriend, is already on the phone with 911. On the phone, he's almost describing the potential manner in which she died without even being asked by the operator. It should also be noted that Jose worked in law enforcement at the time, which has been a very suspect part of this case. The scene of the death is handled very haphazardly, and an initial autopsy would rule the death an accident, citing blunt force trauma from the fall. This is only about a 15-foot drop, so the family is immediately suspicious and they commission a private autopsy. That autopsy would find significant damage to the body, including scratches and multiple lacerations, a severely broken wrist and broken neck, not necessarily congruent with a 15-foot fall, but maybe more so a beating. The death is still ruled accidental for the time being, but there are increasingly suspicious details around it. Follow for part 2. This is part 2 of the Tamala Horsford case. Jose, the homeowner's boyfriend, would actually be fired as a pretrial officer down the line for trying to illegally obtain internal details about Tamala's case file. Investigators lead with the theory that she was just so intoxicated she fell right off the 4-foot banister, but neither a second toxicology report nor videos taken that night show her anywhere near that drunk. Looking at the circumstantial evidence here, it just doesn't add up. She's found with a severely broken wrist, one that hit a major artery that would have pooled blood under the body, although when her body is found, found, there is no blood found under her wrist or her body. The factor of race has played a huge part in this case. Immediately suspects that Tamla was the only woman of color who was invited to this party. Witness testimonies report derogatory comments and jokes that were made at Tamla that very night. One woman calling her Bob Marley, and then the aunt who discovered her referring to her as the woman from the islands. More troubling than that, this is a picture of Chris Shelton, who was the deputy coroner on the scene who determined the manner of death. Not to mention, this is already taking place in a part of Georgia where there is a painful history of racism. One of the last pieces of overwhelming evidence is a deleted Facebook post from the woman who hosted this party. There are no public screenshots of this Facebook post, but it was provided by a friend to CBS 46 and then confirmed from a statement from her attorney saying she misspoke. In her post, she writes, and I quote, "There was no fall from my deck." The post was deleted shortly after. We can't continue to give the benefit of the doubt when there is just so much evidence. Something happened here that we don't fully know. This is a terrifying case. It's terrifying because it could happen to any of us. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the haunting story of the Watcher. On June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus and their 3 children are moving into what they believe is their dream home. This house would later be known as the infamous 657 Boulevard. 3 days following the sale, an anonymous letter is received signed The Watcher. The letter would describe intimate details about the family and claim to be from someone who was watching the house. The letter is brought to the police with the former homeowners, and they're instructed to keep everything quiet while the investigation is underway. 2 weeks would pass, and a second letter is received detailing even more knowledge of the family. Chillingly, the letter is now describing things that are taking place inside the home. Things that you could only report seeing if you were watching through a window. The letter would describe details of watching their daughter paint from inside the house. The family would actually remove their children from the home and then worked for 2 years trying to sell it. But at this point, details of the case and rumors of the house had already circulated through the media, and the house was essentially unsellable. In 2016, they're finally able to find a buyer, but then another letter is received. This letter is vicious and threatening, even going as far as to threaten an accident that could happen to a family member. Despite security cameras, fingerprint samples, cold leads, police are never able to identify the Watcher, nor do they know if the Watcher is still watching 657 Boulevard. I've wanted to cover this case for so long. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the mysterious disappearance of Frederick Valentich. On the evening of October 21st in 1978, Australian pilot Frederick would rent a commercial aircraft for a routine cargo trip. At 7:06 p.m., he radios into air traffic control to ask if there's any expected air traffic at the 5,000-foot level, to which air traffic control says no. He reports seeing a long, metallic aircraft with 4 bright lights moving at very fast speeds. The control room starts to notice a panic in his voice as he realizes the aircraft is getting closer to his, and he asks if maybe it could be a military plane, due to the unknown appearance and the speeds it's able to travel. But the control room repeats they have no knowledge of any known aircraft that's supposed to be in that area, nor one that fits that description. While trying to identify what he's seeing, he radios in that the aircraft is now hovering above his, and he describes a bright green light shining from the base and a shiny metallic exterior. Frederick is then heard on the radio for one final time where he says, "It's not an aircraft." His transmission is then interrupted by an unknown sound which was described as metal scratching together before going completely static. This was his last recorded correspondence before his plane is deemed missing. Despite search efforts and investigations, his plane is never found, and no one really knows what Frederick saw that night. Those final last words are some that have haunted the flight community for decades. Thank you guys so much for 10K. So to mark the milestone, we are going to do a very requested case. This is the infamous story of the Black Dahlia. So everything really begins on January 15th. It's early morning, it's 1947, and a woman who's walking stumbles upon the severed remains of an unknown woman in South Los Angeles. Her body is mutilated. She had been sliced in half, all of her blood had been drained, and she had been cut from the corners of her mouth all the way to her ears. Los Angeles had never seen anything like this. It becomes front page news for over 31 days straight. She's eventually identified as Elizabeth Short. 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was living in Hollywood at the time as an aspiring actress with a little bit of a troubled past. But the theories around this murder are really what's fascinating. The one that makes the most sense to me is that this was most likely carried out by someone with medical experience. The incisions at the corner of her mouth, as well as how how her body was severed would indicate the experience of a surgeon, which leads us to George Hodel. George was a Los Angeles physician who was widely expected of being involved. Not only would he have the medical experience to actually carry out these murders, but his own son comes forward to identify a picture of the Black Dahlia found in a family album. With a history of masochistic fascinations as well as incestuous assaults, he certainly fit the psychological profile of somebody who could carry this out. Although he would be heavily investigated, there is no evidence that can prove his involvement. One of the most infamous unsolved cases of the 20th century. And till this day, no one knows for sure what happened to Elizabeth Short. This case is gonna give you chills. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This story is from a man named Grady Hendrix about his childhood back in the 80s. So his parents had moved into this house around May of 1981. He's like any other 9-year-old kid. He realizes he can sneak downstairs in the middle of the night and grab anything he wants from the kitchen without his parents finding out. Until one night, while he's sneaking down in the dark, he hears something that makes him freeze. The sound of a fork hitting a counter in the kitchen. From the hallway, he can see the outline of a tall, thin man who had been eating at the kitchen counter. He races upstairs and he gets his parents up from their sleep, but of course by the time they go downstairs, there's nothing. But over the next couple of months, there's odd instances of strange noises in the house, there's things being misplaced in the kitchen. Over that summer, while he's lying awake in bed, he hears movements coming from the ceiling above him, so he flips over on his back. He recounts seeing a pair of eyes staring back at him from the ceiling vent. He becomes hysterical, his parents get up, they have to search the attic, they search all the crawl spaces, but still, they're not finding anything. They just keep assuming that he's freaked himself out. But by the end of that summer, an HVAC inspector comes to the house and finds something horrific. The rotting remains of a dead man who had crawled into their vent system and was living in their walls. I can't think of anything more chilling than that, but of course what this meant was that everything Grady had seen was real. Since I've heard this story, I can't look at the vents in my house. I'm so freaked out. Please be careful who your kids are around. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the story of the Demon of Luna Park. Luna Park was a thriving theme park in Australia, even through the late 1970s. It was home to the popular ride known as the Ghost Train. On June 9th of 1979, the Godson family were at the park when a mysterious costumed man approached the family without speaking a word. The mother, Jenny, just assumed that this was a park actor, so she ended up taking this photo of her son Damien standing with the man just before he would join his brother and father riding the Ghost Train that very evening. While the boys are riding, the mother, Jenny, walks off to go grab a snack, but then returns to find the ride completely engulfed in flames. The Ghost Train had been set on fire with 35 people on the ride at the time. 7 of those riders would never make it off, including her husband and 2 children. At some point much later, Jenny would remember the mysterious costumed man who had approached the family just before the fire broke out. She ends up contacting the park owners to try to inquire about who the man might have been, and to their horror, they explain that they do not employ any costumed actors within the park. For years, police have pleaded with the public, but the man in the mask has never been identified and is largely suspected to be involved with the fire of June 9th. Till this day, he is only known as the Demon of Luna Park. Thank you to Ty Hopper for suggesting this case because it is eerie. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the disappearance of Michael Negrete. Michael was a freshman studying under a music scholarship at UCLA in the year 1999, described by his friends as very well liked and a very friendly kid. On December 10th, the night of his disappearance, Michael would attend a dorm party on the same floor as his dorm and then returns to his room and plays a computer video game against a friend who's in another room until 4 a.m. So right after 4, he leaves his dorm to go congratulate his friend across the hall for beating him in the video game and is then witnessed returning to his room. This is the last verified sighting of Michael. The following morning by 9 a.m., his roommate wakes up to find him gone. He hadn't taken any of his clothes, he hadn't taken his shoes, his keys were still there, his wallet, everything of his was still in the room. Police launch a campus-wide investigation that turns up almost nothing. No evidence of any kind of a secret life or a lover. There's no issues to support battles with depression or substance abuse. He didn't even have a car on campus. He's just gone. His disappearance is so mysterious that it gets upgraded from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Multiple witnesses would come forward to report seeing an unknown Caucasian man on the dorm room floor the very night Michael went missing that nobody could account for. They release a sketch of the man, but he has never been identified and never comes forward. Till this day, the case remains unsolved and no one knows for sure what really happened to Michael that night. Thank you to everybody who asked me to do this case. I will do my best. It is highly detailed. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. Bryce is a couple of days into his sophomore year of college when his friends start to notice that he's exhibiting strange behaviors, he's becoming paranoid and consuming substances, so they contact his parents. Concerned, his parents insist that he makes the 7-hour drive back home to stay with them. But the following morning, they get an alert of a service request at a rest stop called Button Willow, so they contact the station. They end up getting a hold of a serviceman who says he'll go check to see if Bryce is still around because he filled up his tank with gas just a few hours before. He does find Bryce, but finds that he's been sitting in the same exact spot for over 3 hours. His parents get a hold of him, and despite the odd behavior, they just end up insisting that he gets on the road. When he's still not home, his parents end up contacting the police. The phone company ends up doing an emergency trace of his cell phone and finds that he is still at this rest stop. It had been like an additional 9 hours of him sitting in the same exact location. Police do show up that evening and they're able to find him, so they end up questioning him, they run a sobriety test, but all of his behavior seems normal and they just have him call his parents, who surprisingly, despite all of this strange behavior, just insist that he gets back on the road. A few more hours go by and the same serviceman from before actually contacts the parents and says that he is still sitting at this rest stop doing nothing. He basically ushers Bryce into his car and then follows him onto the highway to make sure he gets on the road. This would be one of the last verified sightings of Bryce. Follow for part 2. This is part 2 of the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. After he finally gets on the highway, his parents call him and they demand to know where he is. They want to know what landmarks he's around, what he's seeing. He ends up just saying it's too dark, he can't see anything, but his GPS says he'll be home by 3 in the morning. He then calls them back just after 2 a.m. and tells them that he's too tired to drive and he's going to pull off for the night. This would be the last conversation they ever have with Bryce. 6 minutes after that call, Bryce's car is caught on security camera going off-road. He had veered off the highway for an unknown reason and just starts accelerating through rough terrain going up towards a cell tower. At 2:15 a.m. his car is caught on the security camera and then disappears for 2 hours, which are completely unaccounted for, and is then seen one last time at 4:29 a.m. At 5:15 a.m. he floors his car going downhill and flips it off a 25-foot ledge into a ravine, but survives the crash. The car is found by the following morning with the window kicked out and all of his belongings inside, but he is nowhere to be found. Police conduct a number of searches using trace canines that were able to track that after the crash he was able to travel pretty far on foot, but then at some point his trace just disappears. It's possible after the crash he had some sort of head injury and couldn't remember who he was, and he had just wandered off in confusion and gotten lost. But despite multiple search efforts, none of his remains nor any evidence of his whereabouts has ever been found. Till this day, the case is marred with endless questions about what really happened to Bryce that night. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we're looking at 3 seemingly normal pictures with dark backgrounds. Number 1. At first glance, this kind of looks like just any other normal family picture around the holidays, until you take a closer look at the father and see a hand on his shoulder that seemingly does not belong to anyone in this picture. Initially thought to be an optical illusion and that the arm here actually belongs to the boy in the middle, he later comes forward and says that he did not have his right arm around anyone, making the hand seen in this picture a chilling mystery. Number 2. This picture seen here looks like any other normal portrait, maybe of a couple in the early 1900s, but to fuel the horror, this is actually a post-mortem photograph, and the woman seen here is not alive in this photo. Post-mortem photography was actually a common cultural practice even through the early 1900s, where a deceased loved one was dressed and staged and then posed with their family or spouse for one final photo. Number 3. You might skim past this shot as just any other normal picture of maybe 2 college-aged guys at a party, but this is actually a photo of Tyler Hardley after he just killed his parents. Just 3 hours after brutally murdering his parents with a hammer in the upstairs bedroom, he throws a party at his house with the bodies hidden upstairs. Guests at the party had absolutely no idea, making this picture terrifying in context. Before we get into the story, I am going to caution this with a warning, as it does involve assault as well as minors. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the haunting story of the Beast of Jersey. So when we're talking about Jersey here, we're not talking about New Jersey, we're talking about the island of Jersey, which is right off the coast of France. This is a very small town on this island, and it was completely terrorized by a man in a mask through the 1960s. He was known to wander the streets at night, where he would break into houses through open windows and kidnap and assault women and children. To locals, this man was known as the Beast of Jersey. He was described with a wretched smell, and he would wear nail-studded garments undergarments and a horrible rubber mask and then climbed through windows only between the hours of 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. Desperate for answers, the public and their paranoia had initially suspected this man, a local fisherman who was known to be eccentric and lived alone. Locals were actually so enraged that they burned down this man's cottage and he self-exiled. But those suspicions are soon cleared when attacks from the beast continued. It wasn't until 1971 when attention is turned to a man named Edward Pinnell. Edward was a local construction worker and a husband he had no real criminal record to account for. But when pulled over one night by police, officers would notice several costumed items in his car. These costumed items matched the description of the beast. He is arrested and tried and would face 30 years behind bars, convicted on all counts of his brutal assaults. But the painfully dark history of the island still remembers the 11-year reign of the Beast of Jersey. I had to get myself up and out of bed for this because I'd never heard of this case before. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. These are the 13 unaccounted minutes before Patrice Andreas went missing. On April 15th of 2004, Patrice, who's a local salon owner in Georgia, walks into her shop and finishes her last client at exactly 11:37 a.m. Another client then calls the shop at 11:50, to which there's no answer, which is very unlike Patrice. In that 13-minute window, something happens in that salon where Patrice goes missing. The next client comes in to find the shop empty, and police are called to the scene, which is eerily undisturbed. Aside from some missing money in the register, there's nothing that's out of place, there's no sign of a struggle, even her lunch is still sitting there warmed up. But two separate witnesses would come forward to report passing the salon within that time frame. Both witnesses come forward to report seeing a light blue sedan parked out front and two unidentified women standing next to it. One of the women was described as tall with dark hair and the other short with light hair. These eyewitness accounts mark one of the only insights as to what happened in those 13 minutes. After 20 months of searching, her remains are finally found at the bottom of a ravine, but the manner of death is unknown. Initially, her husband is suspected to be involved as maybe a jealous spouse, but a scrutinizing investigation would rule him out. She leaves behind her 15-year-old son at the time, who till this day continues to search for answers as to what really happened to his mom on April 15th. So what are your theories as to those 13 unknown minutes? Halloween is here, Halloween is upon us, it has come. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are looking at 3 unexplained pictures caught on camera, and number 3 is horrifying. Number 1, Loch Ness Lake is famously known as a lake that houses a legendary creature known as the Loch Ness Monster. In a recent photo captured by a tourist, they spot the back of something strange in those waters. This might look like just a large fish, but by proximity to the landmarks around it, whatever this is in the water, it's over 8 feet in length. Number 2, this photo was captured in 2010 with a group of UK teenagers hanging around a construction site for a nearby building. They took several photos on a digital camera and immediately noticed the figure in the window behind them. Freaked out, a couple of the guys try to climb the scaffolding to call out to whoever's hiding in that building, but to their shock, when they got up to the window, they saw that the floor hadn't even been finished in the building and no one could have been standing at that window. Number 3, everybody knows the McDonald's Playscape is a kid's dream location. So when a mother and daughter arrived at one nearby, they were excited to see that there were no other parents or kids around. It was completely empty. While playing in the playscape, the mother captures this photo and sees a gray face standing right next to her daughter inside the tunnel. When the daughter comes down, the mother is distressed and she inquires about who this other child is who's inside the playscape alone, to which her daughter replies, it's her imaginary friend, Beto.